An interim report released by the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions concluded that COVID was, quote, more than likely the result of a research accident in Wuhan. And according to a bombshell report by Vanity Fair and ProPublica published last week, the Wuhan Institute of Virology dispatchers signaled that they faced a, quote, acute safety emergency in November of 2019. Officials at the highest level of the Chinese government weighed in, and urgent action was taken in an effort to address ongoing safety issues.
The documents do not make clear who is responsible for the crisis, which laboratory it affected specifically, or what the exact nature of the biosafety emergency was. Joining us now to expand on this is reporter at US Right to Know, Emily Kopp. Welcome, Emily.
Hey, great to be here.
So help us understand what is new. Obviously, folks have been following this story for a really long time. What is new in this news story?
So what's interesting about this report is it actually draws on public sources. So that sort of memo from the Wuhan Institute of Virology is actually public on the website. And what the Senate committee attempted to do is essentially decode what is called, party speak. So how the CCP might have signaled internal goings on at the lab, and what the Senate committee's staff concluded is that this was a sort of a siren to higher up that something had gone very wrong. Now, this report, it should be said, has touched off an enormous debate in the last few days, because there are, I think, serious questions about whether the Senate committee misinterpreted those reports. So we can dive into those, but probably the biggest question around this is the fact that that sort of memo about a possible serious safety issue at the Wuhan Institute of Virology may have originally been published in August 2019. That doesn't rule out a lab leak. Of course, we know that the Wuhan Institute of Virology's enormous database of bat coronaviruses went offline around September 2019. And we also don't know why they would have republished this memo in November 2019, which seems to have led to sort of the confusion. But there are accusations of mistranslation and some factual errors. Well,
Emily, what other than the fact that there is, there was an emergency and the timing seemed to be pegged toward COVID, leads people to believe that the emergency described in this memo was in fact COVID escaping?
Yeah, so the report also goes into some serious questions about whether biosafety standards at the Wuhan Institute of Virology were up to code. We know that in the years before the pandemic, the Wuhan lab was trying to get its BSL-4 lab up and running. That is sort of the maximum biocontainment standard. And I personally can say, having read like a mind-numbing number of documents under FOIA sort of related to biosafety standards at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, this is a real concern. There were US scientists who were working with the lab to train some of their scientists so that they would understand how to help operate a maximum biosecurity lab. But I think those real concerns have sort of been overshadowed by whether or not this sort of one finding about this one memo was overstated by the committee.
Right, and to be clear, those concerns are significant anyway. You were talking about what sort of disinfectants they were using. I believe that was an issue there. They didn't know if the disinfectants they were using were good enough, or were reacting to the surfaces that they were. It was not like what the building consisted of was not right for what the disinfectants they were using. Also, questions for how long scientists were in lab suits for hours and hours and hours, to the point where they might be exhausted and they might be dehydrated and they might be more prone to error. Right? Can you talk about the things of that nature in the report?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm no expert in the CCP, but I just put in some of the memos into Google Translate, and some of the things that they were talking about were pretty alarming, as you mentioned. Sort of being in the lab for 5 or 6 hours straight without being able to go to the bathroom or being able to eat. They talked about some flooding that had happened at the lab. And so it's clear to me, just having read sort of communications between US labs and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that there was this really ambitious push to have a state-of-the-art lab in Wuhan. And of course, they had this sort of enormous store of bat coronaviruses, including SARS-related bat coronaviruses that they sample from Southeast China. And the question is whether their biosafety standards sort of met their ambitions. And I think that's a real question. So.
Well, according to a preprint released last Friday, COVID-19's genome shows signs consistent with genetic manipulation, which could be evidence that the virus originated in a lab. And Emily broke down those signs in her latest reporting for U.S. Right to Know. So what is the significance of this finding?
Yeah, so this is another really interesting sort of development in recent days. There was a preprint that alleged that something called restriction sites in the SARS-CoV-2 genome appear to be unusually regularly spaced. And essentially, restriction sites are used by bioengineers to cut DNA at certain places. And the restriction sites in the SARS-CoV-2 genome appear to be ideal for a sort of experiment that you would want to do to, say, like, swap out a spike protein. And so that raised some eyebrows. It got a lot of feedback on Twitter, to put it nicely. And so that too has touched off an entire controversy.
Well, what do you mean, Emily? Is there controversy? Are people pushing back against it? And if so, what's the claim?
Sure. So some of the major criticisms were that a sort of classic approach to this sort of genetic engineering would actually remove the restriction sites that the preprint authors were looking at. These are called scars, sort of in the verbiage of synthetic biology. And ideally, you would want a scarless genome without those restriction sites. But the authors have sort of pointed out and have cited the scientific literature that says oftentimes when researchers want to sort of plug and play and do multiple experiments with the same synthetic virus, they will leave in these restriction sites or these scars. So that was one major critique. Another critique is that these restriction sites could have resulted from recombination. In other words, sort of viruses naturally exchanging their DNA. And so yeah, those are the two main ones. I will say this week has been really interesting because I think both with the Senate report and with this preprint, we've seen people sort of do hard research and take big swings and take risks in order to help, us process this sort of enormous circumstantial evidence around the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And we've seen enormous pushback from the scientific community and from the media. And it's an interesting dynamic, but I kind of wish that the scientific community and the media would be directing some of that same energy to, also helping process the enormous circumstantial evidence around the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I feel like the ground is shifting, or the consensus is shifting a little bit, but maybe not at all within the media or within the kind of experts that are really bought into the explanation they had before. But we will see. Emily, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.